Welcome. My name is Olivia Mattis. I'm so delighted that you've joined us here today for a very inspirational story that we're going to tell. We're going to have programs now until the rest of the summer, every Sunday. I hope you will join us every single Sunday between now and Labor Day. And then we will restart after the Jewish holidays. So today we are telling the story of a village in France called Chabannes. And we at the Sousa Mendes Foundation, we also tell a French story. We honor a rescuer, Aristides de Sousa Mendes, who was the Portuguese consul general in Bordeaux, France. His action took place in France. So our story today also looks at France. We have a moderator, and that will be our resident historian, Dr. Mordecai Paldiel, who's on our board of directors and was at Yad Vashem for 24 years. We have the filmmaker of today's beautiful film, the Children of Chabannes, and that's Lisa Gossels, and she is the executive director of the Boston Jewish Film Festival.
Artistic
Director.
Yes, thank you.
Of the Boston Jewish Film Festival. And she's doing fabulous work there. And we also have one of the children all grown up from Chabannes, and that's Dr. NORBERT BIKALES. And he's joining us today with his son, Eddie, by his side. So without further ado, I'd like to present you Dr. Mordechai Paldial, who will lay out the historical groundwork of today's story. Mordechai, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Olivia, and hello, everyone. Today's program will feature the unique story of the rescue of Jewish children, most of whom fled to France from Nazi Germany before the start of the war, in an operation organized by the French Jewish Child Welfare Organization, known by its initials as OSE, O-S-E. Then, as the Germans advanced into France, OSE sent several hundred of the children to the village of Chabannes, where, with the village agreement, they were housed for close to 3 years in a special chateau, and their stay there was made as comfortable as possible by the villagers in light of the difficult wartime conditions. 3 of the village persons stood up among others in their help to the children. They are Felix Chevrier, and here you see him sitting there in the middle with his beret, surrounded by some of the children that were there. He was the man in charge of the children home in Chabannes, and he was honored by Yad Vashem for his friendly and warm treatment of the children, and his several attempts of dispersing the children were in danger threatened of their arrest by the French and the Germans. Also honored by Yad Vashem were the 2 sisters and educators, Renée and Irène Payassou. Here you see them, the 2 sisters next to Chevrier, and this is a sign in the Chabannes, and below you see the sign of OSE. You see the full title, Œuvre de secours aux enfants, and this plaque was set up in 1996, and it honors them for their rescue of hundreds of Jewish children. Well, these 2 sisters, they held classes for the children to make up for their missing attending local schools, and at a later period, they helped them to disperse them in various places in France when threatened with deportation. While as head of the Righteous Program at Yad Vashem, I was privileged to have these 3 persons awarded the title of Righteous Among the Nations. And in the city of Cannes, there is a street named after the two sisters, and we have a photo of that. Matthew, here we are, Boulevard René and Irène Payassou, and underneath that the French title, Juste parmi les nations, righteous among the nations. So, thanks to the combined efforts of these three persons, the French and the Germans were able to capture only 10 of the children, 4 of whom were luckily released through the help of Chevrier, and 6 were sent to concentration camps, with only 2 of them surviving. Now, for a better understanding of conditions in France during that troublesome period, let us have a look at the map of France in 1940. Okay, so here's a map of France. This is like June, July 1940, when France was defeated by Germany. And the Germans divided France basically into 2 parts. One, what is called the occupied part, which appears in yellow. And the other one, which appears in dark blue, is called the free zone. In other words, free in the sense that there were no Germans there. And the Germans allowed the French to set up a government from the city of Vichy. You see Vichy. And luckily for Chabannes, Chabannes was located in the free zone. There is Chabannes on the upper left here. Okay, you see it. So for 2 years, there were no Germans in the free zone, but the French government that operated in the free zone had to collaborate with the Germans. And they had to institute, and they did institute, anti-Semitic laws, not as strict and severe as in the occupied zone, but still very anti-Semitic. And then later on, when they were asked by the Germans to deliver Jews, the French police rounded up Jews and delivered them to the Germans. There is another part of France here on the lower right side in dark green. Dark green. Matthew, you want to show that? The dark green side? Right. This was held by the Italians. The Italians were allies of the Germans. They were fascists, but they did not persecute the Jews in the same to the extent that the Germans. So a lot of Jews fled to the Italian zone. When the Germans took over the free zone, which they took over in November 42. And one of the heroes of this film, whom you will later hear, NORBERT BIKALES, he was later taken to the Italian zone, and from the Italian zone, then later on, with the help of the Jewish underground, with Ose, he was smuggled into Switzerland, which incidentally was my story too. We were in the Italian zone and we were smuggled into Switzerland in late 1943. So look at the map again. Matthew, bring out the whole map. So you can see the situation in France was complicated, divided into 3 parts, and that made it possible for Jewish people first to flee from the occupied zone to the free zone. And when things turned bad in the free zone, many of them fled to the Italian zone, from the Italian zone either into Italy or Switzerland. So that accounts for the high number of Jews that survived in France during World War II. Now, you will hear more of this amazing story from our panelists. First, Lisa Gossels, the producer of the film you watched as a run-up of the program, and whose father and uncle were 2 of the Chabannes children. They were there, but they were lucky that they were able to leave for the United States already in 1941. No, the United States was not yet at war when they left for the United States. And then after Lisa, you will hear Dr. Norbert Bikales, one of the former children of the Chabannes Chateau, who remained there and elsewhere in France for a longer period. Now, I am pleased to introduce Lisa Gossels, and she will later introduce Norbert Bikales. And I want to say a few words about Lisa. She's born in the United States, and she is an Emmy Award-winning social issue documentarian and a celebrated documentary filmmaker. Her film, The Children of Chabannes, was screened at many film festivals and garnered 20 awards. It was aired on HBO and PBS. Lisa is also an educator, a consultant for documentarians, and a writer. She was inspired to make the film on Chabannes largely due to her father and uncle's stories of the time they spent there. Lisa Gossels, the floor is yours, and when you're finished, please turn it over to NORBERT BIKALES. Go ahead, Lisa.
Thank you. Thank you, Mordecai, for this wonderful history lesson and for adding such helpful context for understanding this movie. And thank you to all who are joining us this afternoon. It's wonderful seeing all of your faces. I kind of want to go through all the screens on Zoom and see you all. But Olivia, I'm kind of amazed that you do this every week and have such a loyal audience. So thank you, Olivia, and the Sousa Mendes Foundation for organizing these virtual screenings and conversations around film. Olivia, I'm so glad your organization exists. I want to also express gratitude to Matthew Spurn for your help and technical support. While I'm still a social issue documentarian and will always be one at heart, in February 2022, I became the artistic director of Boston Jewish Film. We present 3 film festivals a year and do year-round programming and also work in schools to combat anti-Semitism. It's a dream job because the role involves, like Olivia's, curating programs and creating community and conversation through the very powerful emotional medium of film. It's a distinct honor for me to be in conversation with Mordecai and Norbert, and now his son, Eddie. I've had the joy of knowing Norbert since we first started making of the Children of Chabannes in 1996. So Norbert, that means we've known one another for 26 years. Norbert is someone whom everyone I met when we were filming remembered decades later with great fondness and love. As you heard Dédé Lelon, one of the local school teachers, say near the end of the film, "You haven't changed. I never forgot you." Norbert, after 26 years, I'd say just the same. It's an honor to have you in my life and in this film. This film truly wouldn't be the same or nearly as good without you. And you taught me so much while we were making it. Eddie, you came into my life right after I met your parents when we were both working in film production in New York City. And through our shared interests and shared histories, we became fast friends. It's great that you're joining us today, and I do miss being in your more regular orbit.
Me too.
So I just love to you both because we've been in each other's lives a long time.
Thanks.
Mordecai, I was so excited. Oh, sorry.
I just said yes, go ahead.
Oh, Mordecai, hey. So I was so excited when Olivia told me who you were. The wonderful, and you know this because we've had 2 Zooms before this, because Olivia is so great at organizing. So the wonderful Paisu sisters, I call the older one Ren. Her name is Irene, but she went by Ren, and she carried herself like very regally like a queen, and Ren means queen in French. So the wonderful Paisu sisters, Ren and Renee, were huge inspirations in the making of this film. I knew they were honored at Yad Vashem years ago, decades ago, and how deeply meaningful that honor was for them. But I had no idea until Olivia told me that you, Mordecai, were the individual who accorded both them and Felix Chevrier the same honor some 30 years later. It's a joy and an honor to know you. You're a fount of wisdom and knowledge and positive energy, and it's time we finally met. So thank you, Olivia, for bringing all of us together. And that includes all of you joining us on Zoom. Thank you for taking the time to watch The Children of Chabannes. I made this film with a wonderful man named Dean Wetherell. We've always called this film a professional labor of love. And if you haven't seen it yet, we definitely want to share it with you in that spirit. So in The Children of Chabannes, we come to know the people in the tiny French village of Chabannes, 3 hours directly south of Paris, who risked their lives and livelihoods to save more than 400 Jewish refugee children during World War II, including my father, Peter, and Uncle Werner. Now, actually, in the map that Mordecai showed you, and it reminds me exactly of the map we used in the film and like these classroom maps you see throughout, Chabannes looks very big, but in fact, Chabannes is a hamlet of 300 people. And it's in this town actually called Saint-Pierre-de-Furzac. So if you all want to look at a map of France, it's going to be hard to find Chabannes, except if you're looking at a Mordecai PowerPoint or a movie. So integral to the Chabannes story, or the extraordinary measures taken by the local teachers and townspeople, children of the French Revolution who truly believed in the French values of liberty, equality, and fraternity, who in concert with the OSE, as we learned, the Jewish Child Welfare Agency that still exists today, sheltered and nurtured and educated the Jewish refugee children in their midst until it was no longer safe for them to be there. Dean Wetherell and I made The Children of Chabannes after Night and Fog, Shoah, and The Sorrow and the Pity, films which spoke to the horrors of the concentration camps and the indifference of people in Germany and Poland to the flight of the Jews. Because so much documentation already existed about the Shoah, Dean and I felt like we had permission to focus more on the positive in our movie, on rescue as a form of resistance, and on the goodness that came out of this very dark period in history. I've always believed that the worst of times has the capacity to bring out the very best in us, and that it's a personal choice. I always get emotional watching The Children of Chabannes because of the humanity and goodness and beauty in this story. I still cry when I see it. And also because, as is natural with the passage of time, a number of people in the movie have passed on since we first made it. In this sentence, I'll include my father, Peter Gossels, whom we lost in October 2019, after 2 years with cancer. Thankfully, he was productive and engaged in life until the end and still practicing law in Boston. Just 1 month before his death, he published a book on Amazon directly called Letters from Our Mother, which contains a lot of stuff, but the heart of it is the letters that his mother, Charlotte, or Lotta, as she was known, wrote him and my uncle Werner after she got them to safety in France in 1939. My father and mother and aunt and uncle moved to the same Boston suburb, Wayland, Massachusetts, in the early 1960s, still live here now, and our families couldn't be closer. That would have made their mother, my grandmother Lotta, for whom I'm named, incredibly happy. Last night, 36 of us spanning 4 generations celebrated my Uncle Werner's 89th birthday. Thankfully, he's still in great health. Unlike many second-generation children of Holocaust survivors, I never felt the daily weight of the Shoah during my childhood. It surely helped that my father had a very slight Boston and not German accent. My father was someone who never dwelled on the past or didn't dwell on the past. He was a pragmatist. Because he was never in a concentration camp, he didn't consider himself a survivor, though others might agree there. In fact, most of his friends had no idea about that part of his history until I was making The Children of Chabannes. While I had a sense of my father's story from a very young age, I didn't know many of the details about his experiences in Chabannes until Dean and I started making the movie. But growing up, the idea of my father's story helped to shape my identity and sense of purpose in life. And when I say his story, I mean how after growing up in Berlin and experiencing anti-Semitism at a young age, and later losing much of his family in the war, he became a refugee at age 8 and a caretaker for his younger brother, Werner. That they were self-made Americans who really came here for the American dream, who emigrated here at ages 12 and 9 and landed in separate Jewish foster homes in the Boston area. That my father was able to go to Harvard and Harvard Law School on scholarship at a time when universities had very strict quotas limiting how many Jews they would accept. As you heard in the movie, my father believed in being a contributing member of society. His response to his own personal tragedy wasn't to feel sorry for himself or bitter, but to make family a priority, to embrace an inclusive and progressive form of Judaism, to be involved with social justice causes and cultural institutions, and to give back through philanthropy. It was always there, the pain of his history, though he mostly kept it hidden from us. During the war, the United States closed its doors to most Jewish refugees seeking sanctuary here from Nazi Europe. that my father and uncle were able to emigrate to the United States in September of 1941 was nothing short of a miracle. They were two of only 311 Jewish refugee children, mostly orphans, that the United States issued visas to between 1940 and 1942. Thanks to the combined efforts of the OZE, the Joint Distribution Committee, the American Friends Service Committee, also known as the Quakers, and Eleanor Roosevelt. The number of issued visas should have been much, much higher. So when I'm screening this movie, one of the first questions people ask is how I came to this story and to making this film. I know, Mordecai, you had that question for me. Remember René Pais, we all know them, and Mordecai showed you like the painting of them, and you just saw the film. The wonderful local school teachers in Chabannes, who are sisters. Well, in the 1960s, the early 1960s, my parents made a special trip to visit them in Paris to thank them for all they'd done for my father and uncle during the war. Thus began a relationship that would span more than 5 decades. When I lived in Paris after college, René and René became like my surrogate grandaunts. Long before I knew that I would become a documentary filmmaker, I thought they'd be amazing subjects for a movie. Although they never had children of their own, René and René adopted children from the French orphanage that one of them ran after the war. So whenever I saw them, they were surrounded by a loving entourage of at least 10 or 15 people. In 1996, my father got a letter from the Paisus, not an email, 1996, letting him know that the OZE was organizing a reunion in Chabannes, bringing the Jewish children together with the people who saved them during the war, including their teachers and the local townspeople. So that plaque that Mordecai showed you, you saw the mural and then the plaque from May 1996. That's where, I met Norbert. That's where we all gathered. It was that reunion that they laid that plaque there for. My father and mother, aunt and uncle, told me they were going to the reunion to express their gratitude to my father and uncle's saviors. My father only learned about this reunion 4 weeks to the day before it was starting, which if any of you are filmmakers know is not a lot of time. The moment my dad told me about the reunion, I started researching by first calling the Paisu sisters in France. And then thanks to a contact list they gave us with like anciens de Chabannes, like some of the children and teachers that used to be there, I started calling them. I started calling many of the children of Chabannes you just met in the movie, including Norbert and Ruth Keller, who spoke of her first boyfriend, and Jerry Gerard, who was one of the two in Chabannes, along with Wolfie, who survived 13 concentration camps. And Jerry was one of the reunion organizers. He put months and months into organizing that reunion. After those calls, it didn't take long for me to realize that there was a much bigger story than even my father knew. As Mordecai alluded to, my father and uncle were only in Chabannes for 7 months. They were actually in 2 other places in France before Chabannes, which is a whole other story. And they were in the United States when actually the deportation started. They got here before the final solution. So for one of the first times in my life, through the making of this film, I actually got it to teach something to my father, which if he were here right now, we'd be really laughing about. So when I learned about the reunion, I was making corporate videos with Dean Wetherell, and we were talking about making another documentary together. When I called to tell Dean about Chabannes and the reunion, he was driving to Home Depot. Within 15 minutes, we made a decision to embark on what will become an unforgettable 3-year filmmaking journey, using a chunk of our life savings to help fund the first shoot. Dean had just learned the month before that he was 1/8 Jewish, a fact that his mother had kept hidden from him. That surely impacted his decision to join me. Dean and I speak fluent French, which was essential for a movie like this, because as you saw, at least half of the people we interviewed are native French speakers. When we arrived in Chabannes, I think they were expecting an English-speaking Hollywood film crew. Instead, they got us and a lovely French cinematographer and French sound engineer and French production assistant. Needless to say, we got embraced by the entire village, and they helped on all our shoots, which if we have time in the Q&A, and if at all of interest, would definitely be a fun question. So in closing, we first met most of the people you saw in the movie in person, including Norbert, in 1996 at a mini reunion in Paris at the home of Ernest Rosner, who's also in the movie, 2 days before the official reunion in Chabannes. That my father had been through similar experiences to the other children of Chabannes surely made it easier for people to trust us, and importantly, to entrust us with telling their stories. By 1996, Norbert and Ruth had already been interviewed for Steven Spielberg's Survivors of the Shoah Visual History Project. Others had come to a point in their lives where they felt a sense of obligation to bear witness. So everyone was more than open to our being there. And in the end, we all became like family. Thank you so much. And now I would love to pass the virtual microphone to Norbert Bikales and his son, Eddie.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I'm sure that we're all interested in how this all started. And you explained it very well. My story is that I arrived in Chabannes after the German occupation of France found me in Paris. And I found out that most of my friends who had come with me from Germany on the Kindertransport were in a little town called Chabannes in the center of France, in the unoccupied zone. So I agitated to get reunited with them, and I succeeded. I succeeded in getting all the paperwork that you needed in those days to travel, particularly from one zone to the other, and also in having the money to do it. I had absolutely no money, and I had to travel by train. Let me tell you one very painful thing that happened to me. Crossing from the occupied zone where I was, Paris, to the unoccupied zone, Chabannes, where Chabannes was. At the border, armed Germans came aboard to search the train. I had letters in German from my parents, the letters that they'd send me after I'd gone to France and before the war started, and therefore when mail stopped in the period between July and September 1939. And of course, this was the only thing of my parents that I had, and I treasured them. But when the Germans came searching the train, I was afraid to have these letters in German, because they would immediately point out that I'm not a Frenchman. And so in a panic, I tore up the letters into tiny little bits and threw them out the window. The windows and the trains opened in those days, so we can throw it out the window. And that was, and when the Germans came through, they had one look at kids. There were 3 of us sitting there, and they just went by. They weren't interested in kids. And that hurt a lot, that I had gotten rid of the last letters of my parents. I still feel very bad about that. So that was a very bad place. In fact, I lived in France for 3 years. I was at the American Embassy in Paris.
In the 1990s.
In the 1990s, thank you. And I avoided going through that town it's on the main line going south toward Chabannes, for example. I did not, I avoided that line. I didn't want to go through that town where this thing had happened to me. I still feel awful about the loss of the last things from my parents. But Chabannes is a different story. Chabannes brings back good memories to me. Everything was very good. We were in an isolated village where that was of no interest to the Germans or the French. And that was good that it was in the middle of nowhere. And it was a big house that somebody had built and not used. And we were about, I'd say, I don't know, but my guess is about 80 to 100 kids at a time. Life was very good in Chabannes. And at first, we had food, because one of the things is that Chabannes is in a region of France that nobody cares about, including the French, certainly, and the Germans. There was nothing there, but there was food because all they had were farmers. And so we had enough to eat, and we had other kids, and the adults, most of them Jewish, were very nice to us and organized things, and so that we were busy with all kinds of activities, and life was very good until August 1942.
Norbert was there until through 1942, and there was a raid by the French gendarmerie in August 1942, and Chevrier was able to disperse the children and use all kinds of tricks to disorient the gendarmes. But I think what we have to remember was on November 11, 1942, the Germans invaded the free zone and took it over. So now the Germans were present both in the occupied and the so-called free zone. And that was November 42. And of course, that increased the danger that they would now come in and try to pick up. So at that time, Chevrier began to make plans with José to disperse the children in the French countryside and possibly to get them across the border, either to Switzerland, which was closer, and also Spain was not too far. But Spain was more difficult because of the mountains. There are very high mountains with snow cover throughout the year. So that's where José got in operation, and many of the children were led into Switzerland by very famous José, a person named Georges Langer. But anyway, in 1942, Chabannes was still in operation for the greater part of the year, yes, with the children there.
We were there, and we never knew what the next day was going to bring, but life was, I mean, the adults, the Jewish, who were mostly Jewish, tried very hard to make life livable for us. We had enough to eat, which was a good deal in those days because there were food shortages all over. We had enough to eat because Chabannes was in an area of France that was almost totally agricultural. There was nothing other than agriculture there. And there was nothing much going on, and that's why the Germans weren't very much interested either in what was going on there.
Norbert, can we see some photos and maybe have you comment on what these photos are?
Yes, go ahead. This photo is of me and my brother in Berlin. I'm about 3 years old, I'd say. And my brother is 8 years older. And this was just a photo that that I had. I don't really know, and I don't know what the circumstances were. But anyway, it was in Berlin where I was born, because I came from Berlin in July 39 on a Kindertransport to Paris. And these are his last photo of my parents and me. We all since we could, my father had been deported and had been allowed to come back to so-called liquidate his business, which he did. He was selling fabric. So he used fabric to make clothing for us, and mine, a winter coat that it was too big, but it would serve me throughout the war. I was wearing it. So, and this picture was taken in the back of the house where we were living, in the apartment building where we were living. Let's see, is there more? This is in Chabannes, in front of a school that's there, that I attended with there were two other boys there, Joe Jacob and let's see, Gerda and Erwin Cosman, yes. This is Cosman and this is Joe Jacob.
You're on the right. You're the one on the far right.
I'm this is me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Far right.
This is me. So and this is a Purim and Chabannes. I'm the kid in the back here, on the right side, in the second row, and these are all other kids. I don't know where.
Norbert, did you want to wear the outfits in the front row, or you did good with your outfit there?
I had and then who had the idea and who found the fabrics and who found this. This is obviously it's a fun photograph that I've kept.
Just I want to add that they were Osei educators there in Chabannes, and they also took great care that the children there should know something about their Jewish backgrounds.
That's right.
So the Osei educators that appeared in the film, thank you, Alicia, that you had them in the film, especially Rachel, she spoke so beautifully. And so I think they organized that Purim festival and the clothing and everything.
Yeah, and that is one of the best days of my life. I found my brother still alive and living in Vienna. He'd been deported from Berlin, and this was through the International Red Cross. You send them a letter saying, I'm so-and-so, I was born on this date in this place, and I'm looking for so-and-so. And my last address was this, and I'm looking for so-and-so, and give as much information as possible. And I did that, and then one day I received a letter from a captain through the American mail, American Army mail, while I was in Switzerland, that Richard, my brother, is looking for me. And so we, through the intermediary of this American officer, we used the American Army mail to set up a meeting at the border, since I couldn't go into Austria and he couldn't come to Switzerland. And we picked my birthday, which is January 7th. But on January 7th, our papers were not ready, so we moved it to January 20th. And this was taken on January 20th, the first time we see each other since 1939, since October 28th, 38, I'm sorry. This is a picture of me in my office at home, my home office. These are some of the volumes here on the left side. These are some of the volumes of an encyclopedia, 18-volume encyclopedia in 2 editions that I edited. Here I am, obviously having survived the terrible period that I had lived through, and I look pretty happy.
Well,
Why not?
one thing you didn't tell people is that you
This is my
eventually
son.
got a PhD in polymer chemistry, and that was your specialty, and ended up back in France as in the embassy in France representing America for matters of science. And how ironic that was.
Yeah, 3 years, yes. I was for 3 years at the American embassy. And first I was on the run, and now I had a diplomatic passport, which is which I cherished. But this was not at the embassy. This was home, and this is my family, and my beloved wife on my side here on her 90th birthday. These are our children and grandchildren.
Fantastic. What a life. My goodness. So I'm going to take the floor back. I'm going to encourage our audience members to continue putting their very interesting questions into the chat box. Right now, it's my pleasure to tell you about our upcoming programs, and that will give you time to formulate your questions and write them in. So next week, we have a free program on a very interesting topic. It's about cartoonists who spoke out during the Holocaust, and that was Dr. Seuss and others who were, like Dr. Seuss, for example, in addition to writing children's books, was also a political cartoonist. Many people don't know that. And so we have the world's expert on the topic, Raphael Medoff, who wrote this really glorious book called We Spoke Out, Comic Books and the Holocaust, with a preface by Stan Lee. We are offering this book, in fact, as well as another book also by Raphael Medoff on the important story of Jan Karski. Both of the books are very beautifully done. And these are gifts we are offering as our thank you to any donors in the next 3 weeks who give $100 or more to the Sousa Mendes Foundation. And so you will get not only these 2 books autographed by Raphael Medoff, but you'll also get admission to our next paid program, which is the one in 2 weeks' time about the important figure Jan Karski. And there we will again have a Mordechai Paldiel. We'll have Michael Berenbaum, the Holocaust historian. We will have Abe Foxman of the Anti-Defamation League. We will have the filmmaker Sławomir Grunberg, who made a film called Karski and the Lords of Humanity. And we're doing that program together with the Jan Karski Educational Foundation. And we always love to partner with other organizations. So I do hope you will sign up for both of those 2 upcoming programs. And so now we're going to show you a little clip of the film about Jan Karski, Karski and the Lords of Humanity.
Karski had an air of moral aristocracy about him, and his narrative had all the appeal of the adventures of James Bond. His dream was to become a diplomat. He was smart, handsome, he studied foreign languages.
He was working for the Polish underground.
One of the leaders in Krakow gave me a microfilm. Gestapo found this microfilm. They could prove you are a spy.
On May 5th, 1943, a secret telegram from Poland's foreign ministry reached the embassy in the United States.
Karski was on his way to Washington with a very special mission to inform President Roosevelt personally of what was going on in Poland.
He saw a lord of humanity. When you describe them, what is happening to the Jews, they will not believe you. What would help our cause if you, with your own eyes, see the situation in the Warsaw Ghetto. I couldn't take anymore, but I reported. We have a choice. We can choose to be robbers, we can choose to be good people. Now I go back 35 years. No, I don't go back, you know. It's not
If you find yourself in a circumstance, whatever it is, you can do something to make a difference. Let Karski's story be one of those that inspires you to try.
So I do hope you will sign up for all of our programs in the weeks to come. And now let's turn to your questions. And one of the questions that is, I think, an important one is about OZE, which was the overarching organization of which this Chabannes story was a part. So the question specifically is, if OZE was a Jewish organization, how is it permitted to function under Nazi or Vichy rule?
Okay, so let me answer that. It's a subject in itself, and it deserves a program which devoted to OZE. The organization, which was created outside of France, was created in Russia, and then it moved to Germany, and then it moved to France in the 1930s. And the program was to help Jewish children who, for one reason or another, they could not be helped by their own parents. But then when Nazi Germany came into play, and there was a possibility of taking children out of Germany into France under the Kindertransport, then OZE came into play, and it began to organize the transport of children to France. All of you have heard of Kindertransport to England. Well, we all know about the 10,000 Jewish children that came to England, but then there were hundreds of children that went to the Netherlands, and many came into France, and OZE organized the transfer of these children with the permission of their parents. And this is a story as told by NORBERT BIKALES just a few minutes ago. In France, how were they allowed to operate? It's very interesting, very bizarre. The French government, which collaborated with the Germans out of the city of Vichy, they allowed Jewish organizations for a time to operate. And so there were a host of Jewish organizations, welfare organizations, and they allowed Jews to, they protected the synagogues, and Jewish children at first were allowed to go to public school. And Norbert himself at first went to a local public school, but then later on that changed and they were expelled. But at the beginning, there was a little bit of more freedom for Jewish organizations to operate in Vichy France. Some of the operatives of the Jewish organization even visited Jewish people who were held in French internment camps, and they were able to smuggle out some of them. So OZE was one of the organizations that was allowed to operate. Later on, it had to go underground, especially when the Germans came in. But they are credited with creating a large network, and up to at least 6,000 children were saved thanks to OZE. Now, the 6,000 children, most of them were placed in the hands of French people out on farms and small towns. It's a whole story there. And some of them were smuggled across the border into Switzerland and Spain. So at the beginning, they worked legally under the Vichy government. And then later on, they worked illegally, OZE, and they worked until the liberation of France in August 1944.
And OZE still exists today, doesn't it? And Norbert, haven't you been involved with them?
I was one of the founders of the group called Friends and Alumni of OSE USA. These are former children saved by OSE, now living in the United States. And we had well over 200 just in the United States that were saved by OSE. And Lisa's father and uncle were among them. And I was president for a long period.
Wonderful. Lisa, how can people see your film after tomorrow night?
Oh my goodness, thank you. And thank you. As I've kind of written, I don't have time to read this beautiful chat. I've read some of them, but thank you so much. And I did share my contact information, my email, and I think my mobile number in the chat. So, or Olivia, you can share. So this film was available everywhere through this distributor, Eddie, you probably know, Docurama, New Video, and then they got bought by a big company, and then they dropped a bunch of our titles like some years ago. So we were available on Amazon and Netflix and everywhere. Now we're on only available on Canopy streaming. So if you all have public library cards in your public library, gets Canopy, that film, and actually my second film, My So-Called Enemy, are there. We just had a screening, Yom HaShoah, at my organization in Boston in April. And actually the Joint Distribution Committee, we have a screening coming up, I think it's September 17th or something, that's going to be online, and they wanted my Uncle Warner because they helped save my dad and uncle. So they wanted it to be a program of just the two of us. So that I think is happening on September 17th. And, you know, if anybody's interested in doing a screening, reach out to me. And I can also like get links, or we have DVDs and stuff like that. But I wish it were more widely available, because this film is so much. Dean and I never would have made this film if it was only about the past. This is about the present. It's about us now. You know, we have a global refugee crisis right now, the largest the world has seen since World War II. We have an unjust invasion of Ukraine right now. This film is about welcoming, its inclusion and embracing differences and welcoming refugees into our midst. This is a film that is so of the moment and of the day, you know? And so anyway, that's why whenever I see it, I bring a new lens to whatever's happening in politics and in the world to the watching of the film. So, you know, it warms my heart. It's still available. Norbert, you have been without me. This is such a joy to be in conversation with you, because Norbert has been doing a lot of speaking with the film. We don't live in the same area, and you were living in the DC area for a long time. So, you've done a lot of speaking with the Children of Chabannes, and I don't know if you still want to do that.
Is there a French language version of your?
Yes, we do have a French language version of the film. Yes. And the school has been named, oh, that was in the postscript to the movie. The local school has been named after Felix Chevrier. I mean, the one thing I would just say, and I'm not looking at my notes, and Mordecai, I'll take one other question if you have it, because I prefer that, but just this act of watching it. Oh, I feel like I'm echoing myself. The act of watching a movie like this is an act of bearing witness. Like, this is now your story to share with others. And I just kind of want to share that with everybody. And yeah, I feel like this is a film that should be, it is in some curricula. I feel like it could be in a lot more. And it's just touching to see that it's still resonating. And it was filmed on film, by the way. Most of it was filmed on 16mm film.
Norbert, is there anything more you'd like to add? And there's somebody who wants to ask specifically if you remember Kristallnacht. Maybe you have a memory of that.
I do remember Kristallnacht. It's hard to forget, and I don't want to forget. I was in Berlin at the time, and frankly, our area was not very much affected by it. We lived in a almost totally non-Jewish area of Berlin. We were not affected, but I heard the next day, my mother told me what had happened. And I went, I don't know whether she came with me or I went by myself on the subway to see the parts that had been where stores had been broken into and looted and smashed to bits. And I saw that.
And what about your synagogue?
Our synagogue was set afire. Thank you. Our synagogue was set afire, but because it was in the backyard of an apartment building, the firemen were there, make sure that it doesn't spread. So after the Torah and all the prayer books had been burned, the fire was put out.
Wow.
And the building still stands and I came last time I was in Berlin. I visited it. It was now some
Seventh-day Adventist.
Seventh Day something. So some sect like that occupies it. But there's a brass plaque on the outside. Here stood a synagogue, destroyed on October 28, 1938, and under the Rabbi Kantorovsky, that was his name.
Norbert, it feels like a privilege to be sharing this Zoom screen with you because you are an eyewitness to the story we're telling today. And it feels like through you, we're touching history. So thank you for that.
I tell you, it's not a pleasure to be a witness to that. Usually one says, oh, it's my pleasure.
Mordechai, what would you like to say?
Well, as for my final thoughts, many of you no doubt have heard of the Protestant Le Chambon village, where the inhabitants turned it into a place of refuge for many Jews, with many of the villages subsequently being honored by Yad Vashem. Now, another Protestant stronghold in southern France, not so far from Chabannes, which merits mention today, is the village of Dieu-le-Fils in Provence, a name that translated into English means made by God, Dieu-le-Fils. I mentioned that because it was really God sent. For during the German occupation of many Jews and other refugees, well-known writers, philosophers, and artists, they found refuge in this village of 2,500 souls. The title of righteous among the nation was bestowed upon 11 inhabitants by Yad Vashem. It is told that everybody knew of the Jews living there, but nobody spoke. Even the mayor, who had been appointed by the Vichy collaborationist government, kept quiet, although he was aware that his secretary secretly forged false identity cards. Not a single Jew was arrested during the whole period of the war. Now, I will return to Chabannes. What makes the Chabannes story different than the ones of Le Chambon and Dieu-le-Fils is that these two Protestant communities, religion played a big role in their decision to help out. While in Chabannes, a secular stronghold, the motivation was plain pity, compassion, and humanitarianism. Considering these places of refuge of Jews, it also underlines the importance of organized Jewish self-help, such as OZE, one of many other Jewish help organizations, and whose representatives were there with the children in Chabannes throughout. Jewish self-help organizations initiated rescue operations in tandem with Frenchmen of all walks of life, people who were outraged by the treatment of Jews by their own Vichy government and the German occupiers. These dual efforts of Jewish organizational and large-scale non-Jewish readiness to help Jews on the run accounts for the high figure of Jews saved in France. In fact, over 2/3, one of the highest survival rates of any other European country under German control. Sure, there were other factors, political, geographical, that contributed to this high survival figure, but not to be forgotten is the dominant part played of Jewish self-help organizations, such as OZE, in that undertaking. It was the Jose that took part in bringing Norbert out of Germany to France, then placed him in the Chabannes children home. And when danger threatened, Jose moved him to another place, Chambéry, and then organized his flight into Switzerland, where he was finally safe. This role of Jewish self-help organizations in France needs not only to be applauded, but also made more known among Jewish communities far and wide. This is all I have to say as a concluding thought. So Olivia, it's time for you to say your own concluding words.
My concluding words are just words of gratitude for Norbert's life, for his family, for Lisa's film, for her father and uncle, for you, Mordechai, our treasure on our board of directors, and our audience that comes week after week. See you all next week and have a wonderful rest of your day, everybody. Bye-bye and be well.